Welcome to our analysis. Today, we're diving into a massive paradigm shift regarding hardship, harmony, and divine discipline.
Okay, let's dive into this. The Prophet's companions actually worried if life got too easy. Had God forgotten them?
It's wild, but the pre-Islamic root of the word Islam actually meant willingly paying off a debt in full.
Building on that, the root of deen, or religion, literally means debt. Mind-blowing aha moment, right?
Since every single breath is a debt we can't repay, God simply asks us to acknowledge it for paradise.
So Rabb isn't just a creator. He's an active disciplinarian, raising us up through a process called Tedbiryay.
And this brilliantly illustrates how everyday struggles, wealth, family conflicts, difficult kids, are actually just tools for God's discipline.
Even Abu Bakr was tested by a man he financially supported, who then turned around and slandered his daughter. Take Prophet Yusuf. His extreme hardships, surviving a well and a prison, were the exact stepping stones to ultimate greatness.
Contrast the Western worldview of tragedy and original sin with the Islamic foundation, which is built on pure harmony.
Earthly trials aren't some tragic punishment just for existing. They're actually a carefully curated education for your soul.
Let's move to and see how this builds. Historical idolaters didn't deny a creator, they just denied his active intervention.
Which brings us to a huge, high-energy question. So what exactly is the problem with modern ignorance today?
Modern secularism echoes the ancient Meccans perfectly, believing in God, but demanding he stay completely out of our daily affairs.
Rejecting the Rabb basically means wanting all the perks of creation without any of the Creator's discipline.
The poet Seyrani brilliantly mocked his own exile, pointing out you literally cannot escape the ultimate Rabb's domain.
Now, what's really interesting here is how divine discipline is always permanently coupled with infinite mercy and forgiveness.
The source strikingly suggests even hell acts like an intensive care unit, a final manifestation of God's encompassing mercy.
Ultimately, worldly trials are just incredible opportunities to level up in the school of life, never random, chaotic tragedies.
So if your hardships are actually your medicine, are you finally ready to embrace the discipline? Think about it.
Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into a seriously profound paradigm shift from our source text. We're going to completely rethink how we view life's hardships, betrayals, and just those everyday struggles we all go through. We're actually going to reframe the divine here, moving away from this idea of a distant creator to one who is intimately and constantly involved in our everyday lives. So let's start with a really relatable human struggle. Why is it that the people we help the most sometimes end up hurting us the most? The source material illustrates this perfectly with a historical account about Abu Bakr. He was financially supporting a poor relative of his, but then a devastating, malicious slander was spread about Abu Bakr's own daughter. Just imagine the heartbreak there, right? And to make it worse, the very man he'd been feeding and supporting was one of the main people spreading the lies. Naturally, Abu Bakr was deeply hurt, and he decided, you know what, I'm cutting off his financial support, which, let's be honest, makes total sense to most of us.
But here is where the paradigm totally shifts. A divine revelation gently corrected Abu Bakr, basically suggesting that cutting off the support wasn't really the most beautiful or highest approach. And how did Abu Bakr respond? He didn't just grudgingly resume the payments. He turned to his Lord and said, "O Lord, from now on I will give twice as much, I promise." He completely accepted the divine discipline and just completely bypassed his own ego.
And that brings us to a foundational concept in the text, tarbiyah. Tarbiyah is divine education or discipline. It essentially means that our everyday struggles, whether that's a sudden financial loss, a painful betrayal by a friend, or honestly, even just raising a difficult child who drives you crazy, they aren't random punishments. Not at all. Instead, they're a customized education curriculum from a loving Lord. The text emphasizes that the moment we grasp this message, the hardship literally transforms into an opportunity for spiritual elevation.
Now, to really understand how someone willingly submits to this kind of education, we have to look at the language itself. The source points out this fascinating pre-Islamic meaning of the word Islam. Long before it became the name of the religion, the Arabs actually used it to mean willingly and fully paying a debt to a creditor. So when you combine this with the root word of deen, which translates to debt, this beautiful picture emerges. Islam is the act of willingly paying our existential debt to God, fully acknowledging that every single breath we take is essentially a loan.
This perfectly illustrates a deep theological contrast highlighted in the source. You see, Western and Christian frameworks are often heavily built on tragedy. Think about the concept of original sin. The expulsion from Eden is this tragic punishment, and this inherent ongoing conflict between humanity and the divine. The Islamic framework, however, operates completely differently. The text argues there is actually no fundamental tragedy in this framework. Instead, it presents a Lord who educates and a human being who is designed to willingly harmonize with that exact education.
All right, let's get into section 1, Rububiyat, the intervening Lord.
So what exactly do we mean by an intervening Lord? Well, a Rabb is a Lord who actively nurtures, tests, and educates us in the absolute minutiae of our daily lives. So how do our own actions fit into this? According to the text, every single sin committed, going all the way back to the very beginning with Adam, is fundamentally a rebellion against this active lordship, this rububiyat. But here is the truly beautiful part. The act of repentance is actually a manifestation of that exact same lordship. God granting us the ability to repent is basically His way of stepping in and continuing our education.
We can visually map out how this divine education works by looking at the incredible story of Prophet Yusuf or Joseph. It is the ultimate example of tarbiyah. If you look at his life without this specific lens, it just looks like a chaotic sequence of terrible tragedies. Thrown in a well by his own brothers, sold as a slave in the desert, thrown into a dungeon after a completely false accusation. But when you view it under the lens of rububiyat, God was meticulously educating him through every single hardship to ultimately elevate him to become the Sultan of Egypt. It's like a giant perfect puzzle.
Moving right along to section 2, the timeless resistance to rububiyat.
You know, throughout history, humanity hasn't really struggled all that much with the idea of a creator. The real struggle has been with an intervening one. For prophets like Nuh, Hud, Ibrahim, Lut, and Musa, the text points out that their main conflict with their societies wasn't actually proving that God existed. The polytheists of those times usually already believed in a supreme creator. The actual conflict was proving that this creator had the ultimate authority to intervene in their personal lives, their markets, their bedrooms, and their social structures.
We see this so vividly with historical tyrants. When Pharaoh audaciously claimed, "I am your supreme Rabb," he wasn't claiming he literally created the heavens and the earth. Nobody would have believed that anyway. His arrogance lay in claiming absolute dominion and rububiyat over human life on earth. He just wanted to dictate all the rules. Similarly, when Prophet Ibrahim debated the tyrant Nimrod, he didn't say, "My God created the sky." He resolutely stated, "My Rabb gives life and death," asserting God's active, ongoing intervention right here and now.
Now, the really crucial point here is how this ancient mindset connects directly to us today. Our source material draws a very sharp parallel between these ancient polytheists and the modern secular mindset. Many people today easily accept that a creator exists, sure, but they firmly reject his active lordship. The modern sentiment is essentially, yeah, God exists, but keep him out of my business, keep him out of my politics, keep him out of my daily affairs.
To highlight the absolute absurdity of trying to escape God's jurisdiction like that, the source shares this perfect historical anecdote. The 19th century poet Seyrani was being threatened with exile by the Ottoman Sultan Abdülmecid because of his political opposition. Seyrani's brilliant response? He said, "If it is possible to find a place God hasn't created, exile me there. Because ultimately, everywhere is the domain of the Rabb. You literally cannot escape his classroom."
Which brings us to section 3, the intensive care unit of the soul. So, how should we interpret severe suffering and divine punishment through this lens of continuous education? Well, the source notes a really beautiful pattern in the Quran. The title Rabb, the disciplining, educating Lord, is constantly paired with the names Rahim, which means merciful, and Ghafur, which means forgiving. Why is that? Because a Lord who actively disciplines and educates must also be deeply merciful. The student, us human beings, we are inherently flawed. We are absolutely going to make mistakes in this divine classroom, so we naturally require continuous correction, but wrapped in infinite mercy.
But what about those who just completely reject the education altogether? The source uses a remarkably powerful analytical metaphor here. It compares hell to an intensive care unit. The idea is, if you outright refuse to be treated and educated in the gentle ward of this world, you are eventually moved to the intensive care unit for ultimate spiritual purification. It even views the historical persecution of Muslims in Mecca not merely as senseless torture, but as this rigorous, intense school that actually prepared them for their ultimate success.
Okay, our final section, section 4, the language of the prophets.
As we wrap up this explainer, let's take a look at how the greatest students of this divine education, the prophets themselves, actually spoke to their Rabb. The text provides a series of these deeply reverent and emotional prayers. First, let's look at Prophet Nuh. After the immense, unimaginable trial of the flood, we see this incredibly humble plea. My Lord, I seek refuge in you from asking about that of which I have no knowledge. It's just this profound recognition of his own limitations and a deep, genuine desire to be protected from his own ignorance by his educating Lord.
Then we have Prophet Yusuf. Remember all those trials we talked about earlier? Well, at the absolute height of his worldly power, sitting on the throne as the literal Sultan of Egypt, he didn't ask for more wealth or a longer rule. In complete awe and humility, he simply asked his Lord for a righteous end. Take my soul as one who is submitted to you, and join me with the righteous. That is total submission to Rububiyyat.
We also see this with Prophet Musa. At his absolute lowest point, sitting there exhausted as a fugitive in Midian after accidentally killing a man, his desperate prayer demonstrates a complete surrender to his Rabb's discipline. My Lord, I have wronged myself, so forgive me. He owns his mistake completely, making no excuses and opening himself right back up to God's continued education. But the emotional climax of these prayers, as highlighted in the source, is Prophet Muhammad's supplication after being physically attacked and left bleeding by the people of Taif. In a state of absolute exhaustion and pain, he prayed, "To you I complain of my weakness. If you are not angry with me, I do not care what I suffer." This perfectly, beautifully encapsulates what it means to totally submit to Rububiyyat. The physical suffering becomes entirely irrelevant as long as the connection with the educating Lord remains intact.
And that brings us to the end of our explainer. We've seen how Tedbiryay reframes our entire existence, taking it from a series of chaotic, random events into a meticulously designed curriculum by an intervening, incredibly loving Lord. So we want to leave you with this to ponder. When life hits you with its next inevitable trial, will you view that hardship as just a random tragedy, or are you ready to embrace it as a customized invitation to grow from your Rabb?
So, I want you to imagine a scenario. Just picture a relative that you have personally fed and housed for years.
Right, someone who relies on you completely.
Exactly. You are their safety net.
Yeah.
And then suddenly this person starts a completely vile, reputation-destroying rumor about your teenage daughter.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, you trace the whispers back, and you realize the main person fanning the flames of this slander is, the very person eating food paid for by your wallet.
Which is just the ultimate betrayal.
He really is. And, your immediate instinct is to cut them off entirely, right? Sever all ties, walk away with a totally justified sense of righteous anger. But today, we're going into a deep dive on a philosophical framework that suggests giving in to that entirely natural human instinct, well, it would actually be your biggest mistake.
It really flips the script, because it's a framework that asks us to look at the absolute worst moments of our lives. The betrayals, the financial ruins, the inexplicable illnesses, and it asks us to completely categorize them differently.
Yeah.
So today we are unpacking a really profound theological lecture by the scholar Mustafa İslamoğlu. And he focuses on the Islamic tradition's beautiful names of Allah, specifically zeroing in on the concept of Rabb, which is often flattened in English translation simply as Lord.
Right, Lord, which feels so passive sometimes. But tied to that is this incredibly heavy, multi-layered concept called Tedbiryay.
Yes.
Usually you see it translated as divine nurturing or discipline or education. But as this source material breaks it down, it goes so much deeper than just a simple cosmic schoolhouse.
Much deeper.
Our mission today is to fundamentally rewire how you view the friction in your life. Whether you were deeply religious, someone fascinated by comparative philosophy, or just insanely curious about how different civilizations build psychological resilience, the mechanics of the universe presented here are going to challenge your baseline assumptions.
They absolutely will, because the ideas we're looking at touch on human psychology, ancient economics, the roots of Western literature, and, the very nature of suffering itself.
It's a massive.
It is. It asks a seemingly impossible question. How are we supposed to respond to a world that constantly hurts us without becoming cynical and completely closed off?
So let's jump right into the deep end with that opening scenario of the ultimate betrayal, because that wasn't a hypothetical situation.
Right. It's historical.
Yeah. The source highlights a very specific historical anecdote to anchor this entire philosophy. We are talking about Abu Bakr, one of the closest companions of the Prophet Muhammad, and a man named Mistah.
And to really grasp the gravity of this, we have to look at the socioeconomic dynamics of 7th century Arabia. Mista was a poorer relative of Abu Bakr, and in a tribal society, there is no state welfare system.
Right, no unemployment checks.
Exactly. Your survival depends entirely on your kinship network. Abu Bakr was essentially providing Mista's entire livelihood. He was his patron, his absolute safety net. Then, an infamous event occurs, historically known as the event of the If.
Yeah.
A devastating, completely baseless rumor begins circulating about Abu Bakr's daughter, Aisha.
And we have to remember, in a society where honor and reputation are literally currency, a rumor like that isn't just gossip. It is a social death sentence.
It threatens the fabric of the entire community.
It does. And as the community is tearing itself apart over this slander, Abu Bakr discovers that Mista, the man whose survival he guarantees every single day, is one of the primary individuals spreading the lie.
It cuts on such a primal level. It is a violation of kinship, gratitude, just basic human decency.
And Abu Bakr reacts exactly the way any rational human being would. He is deeply wounded, and he makes a solemn oath. He declares he will never spend another dime on Mista. He just cuts him off completely.
Which is entirely logical.
I mean, let's unpack the logic here, because cutting off his allowance seems like the most justified response in the world. If someone actively tries to destroy your family, removing your financial support is like the bare minimum consequence. Why does the lecture present Abu Bakr's reaction as a problem?
Well, this is where that concept of turbi enters the picture. The source points out that a divine revelation, a verse from the Quran, was sent down addressing this exact hyper-specific domestic dispute.
Which is wild to think about.
It is. The verse essentially tells Abu Bakr that while his reaction makes perfect sense for an average person operating on baseline human instincts, it is not a handsome or fitting attitude for someone of his spiritual caliber. It challenges him to elevate his response, asking basically, do you not love that Allah should forgive you?
It is demanding that he bypass his ego entirely. And Abu Bakr's reaction to this correction is what really shifted my perspective when I was going through the source material. He doesn't just begrudgingly reinstate the original allowance.
No, he goes much further.
Right. He turns to his Rabb and says, I promise, from now on, I will give him double. He literally doubles the financial support for the man who tried to ruin his daughter's life.
And that decision is presented as the ultimate manifestation of turbi. We tend to view wealth or power or influence as tools that we wield to shape the world around us.
Right.
But this framework flips that dynamic completely. Wealth isn't just a tool you use, it is a tool used upon you.
That's such a shift.
Yeah, how you distribute it, how you react when the recipient is ungrateful, how you handle the betrayal, all of that is the actual mechanism of your own spiritual and psychological discipline.
I really struggled with this initially because it sounds almost like masochism, like you are rewarding bad behavior.
Right, the tit for tat mentality.
Exactly. But the argument isn't about Mista, it is entirely about Abu Bakr's internal state. If Abu Bakr cuts him off, he is operating on a transactional level. By doubling the allowance, he transcends the betrayal, he breaks the cycle of retaliation. The betrayal itself becomes the anvil on which his character is forged.
He's being elevated by acting in direct opposition to his base instincts. The lecture makes the case that human beings are made beautiful, they achieve their highest potential, only when they are subjected to this kind of intense counterintuitive friction.
Let's bring this down from the heights of 7th century historical drama to, our daily lives. Because the source uses some incredibly relatable examples of how this turbi manifests for the rest of us. Take the concept of peacemaking.
Oh, this is a great one.
Imagine you have two colleagues or friends who are locked in a bitter dispute. You decide to step in, sacrifice your own time, and try to mediate a truce. It's like trying to break up a catfight.
And anyone who has ever attempted this knows it is an absolute minefield. You try to remain neutral, you try to bridge the gap, and inevitably, both parties turn their frustration toward you.
Yeah, you get scratched by both cats, you become the scapegoat for their mutual anger, you end up taking the brunt of the hostility you were just trying to resolve.
Which is exhausting.
Totally. And the natural response is to throw your hands up in disgust, walk away, and vow to never get involved in someone else's mess again. You let cynicism win. But looking through the lens of turbi, this exact scenario is a customized test.
Right.
The friction of them turning on you isn't an accident. It is the curriculum.
And the lecture frames it beautifully. It suggests that making the initial effort to bring peace is only the first part of the test. The real test, the moment of actual divine discipline, is when you get battered for your good intentions.
Will you give up?
Exactly. Do you allow the world's ingratitude to extinguish your desire to do good? Or do you recognize the scratches and bruises as your own personal terbiye, internalize the lesson, and maintain your moral compass regardless of the outcome?
It is about decoupling your actions from the immediate, tangible reward. You do the good thing because the act of doing it polishes your soul, not because you expect a thank you card.
Yes. And the second everyday example the lecture touches on is even more universal. Parenting.
Oh man, parenting.
There is a description of children in the material that I found hilarious and just painfully accurate. It notes that kids never just sit still on the ground, they don't stay put in the sky, they are a constant roaming source of chaos and trouble. As a parent, the dominant narrative is that you are the one doing the shaping. You are the sculptor and the child is the clay. You spend all your energy thinking, I have to discipline this child, I have to raise this child, I have to mold them into a functional adult.
But this philosophy inverts that dynamic completely.
Entirely.
The child is actually the instrument of your turbe. God is using the relentless needs, the tantrums, the irrationality of the child to file down your impatience, your selfishness, your arrogance. You think you are raising them, but they're actually raising you.
It forces a massive shift in perspective. When you are operating on 3 hours of sleep and your toddler is screaming in a grocery store, viewing the situation merely as an annoyance leads to anger and resentment.
Sure.
But viewing it as a highly specific, customized spiritual workout, a moment where your Rabb is actively engaging with your character flaws, it allows you to approach the chaos with patience and even a bizarre sense of gratitude.
The friction is the polish. So next time your mediation effort blows up in your face, or your kids push you to the absolute brink, taking a breath and recognizing it as turby changes everything. You stop being a victim of circumstance.
You become an active participant in your own development.
Right. And this idea of being fundamentally shaped and polished leads us into a deeper question. If our entire existence is a school of discipline, how are we supposed to define our relationship with the entity running the school?
To answer that, the source takes us on a really fascinating linguistic digression. We need to look at the etymological roots of some incredibly common terms, starting with the word Islam itself.
Because if you ask anyone on the street what Islam translates to, you will almost universally get one of two answers: submission or peace. They are the standard textbook definitions.
And they are valid later theological definitions. However, the lecture points us back to the Jahiliyyah, the pre-Islamic era in the Arabian Peninsula. We have to look at how the Arabs of that specific time and place used the root of this word in their daily lives, long before it became the name of a global faith.
Because we are talking about a mercantile society.
Yeah.
Trade, debt, caravans, commerce, that was the lifeblood of their culture. And in that highly specific economic context, they had a very practical use for this linguistic root.
They did. In the pre-Islamic debt economy, the word was used to describe a very specific type of transaction. It meant paying one's debt to a creditor fully and willingly.
Okay, let's pause on that word willingly. It is not just about the mathematical transfer of funds.
No.
It implies a state of mind. You aren't paying it begrudgingly. You aren't being dragged to debtor's prison. You are acknowledging the debt and handing over the payment with a clear, willing heart.
That psychological component is crucial. And then the lecture builds an equation by looking at another ubiquitous Arabic term, deen. When you hear Deen al-Islam, it is almost always translated as the religion of Islam.
Right. But the linguistic root of deen is also steeped in the language of commerce. The root meaning of deen is also debt.
So when you put those two etymological puzzle pieces together, the philosophical implications are pretty staggering.
Yeah.
If deen fundamentally means debt, and Islam originally carried the connotation of paying a debt fully and willingly, then the religion of Islam is, at its linguistic core, the act of willingly paying your cosmic debt to the divine.
Here is where it gets really interesting to me and where I started to wrestle with the concept. Because thinking of existence as a debt sounds incredibly heavy.
It does.
Imagine holding a mortgage. But the terms of the mortgage are that every single breath you take, every time your heart beats, every moment of joy you experience actually adds to the principal balance. You are consuming the creditor's resources just by existing. How do you pay off a mortgage where every single breath adds to the principal?
It creates a mathematical paradox. The source explicitly asks this question: can a human pay their debt to Allah? Every breath is a debt, every moment is a debt. You can't pay off a cosmic debt with more debt. You cannot offer God anything that does not already belong to God.
It sounds like a setup for guaranteed failure. You are born into a state of cosmic insolvency that you can never, ever work your way out of. If a human creditor set up a system like that, we would call it extortion.
Or predatory lending, yeah. But that would only be true if the creditor operated on human economics. The lecture reveals a profound theological loophole provided in the source based on the nature of this specific creditor. Because the debt is inherently unpayable by the human being, the fundamental requirement of payment changes.
God doesn't demand the principal balance.
Exactly the opposite. The requirement shifts from restitution to recognition. The source states that God simply asks the human being to confess and acknowledge the debt.
Acknowledging the debt is accepted as full payment.
Yes, a deep, sincere acknowledgement that you owe everything and owe nothing is accepted as the full payment. And as a bonus, you get heaven.
Confess your debt, and I will accept it as paid. That completely re-engineers how we experience gratitude. Usually, our concept of gratitude is highly transactional.
Right, you do a favor, I do a favor.
Someone buys you a coffee, you say thank you, the social ledger is balanced. But this philosophy argues that true gratitude to the divine is entirely non-transactional. You can never balance the ledger.
No.
Instead, it is a state of perpetual, humble recognition. You aren't frantically trying to pay off the mortgage of your existence.
Yeah.
You are living in a state of awe that you have been given the house for free, provided you recognize who built it.
It shifts the psychological burden from a crushing anxiety of unworthiness to a liberating sense of reliance.
It's beautiful, honestly.
And this mechanism of debt forgiveness naturally shapes the overarching narrative of human history. If our foundational relationship with the Creator is based on this generous, accommodating dynamic, it forces a massive ideological clash with other major worldviews. We have to ask, is the story of human existence inherently a tragedy, or is it a harmonious upward journey?
So İslamoğlu dives into comparative theology here to highlight how different civilizations answer that question. To trace the origin of these worldviews, we have to go back to the foundational mythos of human origin, the story of Adam.
Let's look at how the source frames the Islamic narrative of Adam. It starts with a failure. Adam disobeys his Rabb. And the lecture makes a vital point here. Every sin, at its core, is a rebellion against God's lordship, against Rububiyyat. It is a rejection of authority.
Right.
But the defining characteristic of this narrative isn't the disobedience. It is the sequence of events that immediately follows it.
Right. What happens next?
After Adam disobeys, he doesn't just spontaneously invent a way to apologize. The lecture emphasizes that Adam receives words of repentance from his Rabb. Repentance itself is a manifestation of Rububiyyat. The ability to repent and the specific formula for repentance is provided by the very entity he rebelled against.
So the creditor hands him the exact currency needed to wipe out the debt of the sin.
It is a profound manifestation of nurturing. Nurturing doesn't stop because of a mistake. The mistake triggers a new phase of the nurturing. Adam repents using the words given to him, and he is forgiven. And only after this complete cycle of sin, repentance, and forgiveness is Adam sent down to earth.
That sequence changes the entire meaning of human existence on this planet. Earth is not a prison planet. It is not the site of our exile and punishment for messing up in paradise. Because the sin was already forgiven before he arrived here, Earth is actually the reward for the repentance.
Not the punishment for the sin. This creates a paradigm of fundamental harmony. Humanity begins its earthly journey with a clean slate. There is no inherited cosmic guilt dragging us down from the moment of birth.
Compare that to the cultural narrative that has heavily influenced the West. Even if you aren't religious, if you grew up in a Western society, you have likely absorbed the structure of the tragic worldview.
I should note here, we are neutrally reporting the source's philosophical argument, not endorsing a religious bias. But the lecture contrasts the Islamic narrative with the historical Christian doctrine of original sin.
Okay, lay that out for us.
In that framework, the source argues you place humans in a state of perfection, introduce a forbidden tree, add a deceptive serpent, the humans fail the test, and a cataclysmic rupture occurs between humanity and the divine. Humanity is cast out in a state of inherent sinfulness, a tragedy that eventually requires the ultimate sacrifice, the crucifixion, to atone for the inherited guilt.
So the source is claiming that this fundamental original sin narrative
Yeah.
shaped entire cultures.
Exactly. The source argues that Western art forms, things like theater, Greek tragedy, the structure of the novel, they developed out of this worldview of inherent conflict between humans and the divine. If your cultural DNA teaches you that human existence is defined by a tragic fall from grace and an unresolved cosmic tension, your art, your philosophy, and your psychology will reflect that inherent conflict.
It creates a view of life as a desperate struggle against a broken nature.
Whereas the Islamic worldview, the source argues, is built on harmony and order, not conflict and rupture.
To illustrate the darkest extreme of what happens when a society views humanity as fundamentally severed from divine harmony, the lecture cites a really chilling historical moment. It points to a, quote, famously attributed during the Albigensian Crusade, specifically the massacre at a settlement in the 13th century.
The Crusaders were about to breach a city that contained a mix of folks they considered heretics and Orthodox Catholics. The military leaders asked the papal legate how they should distinguish between the two groups during the sack of the city.
Identifying the innocent versus the guilty.
Right, and the response, famously reported in history, was, kill them all, God will know his own.
Kill them all, God will know his own. Slaughter the entire population, 30,000 people, innocent and guilty alike, and let God sort out their souls in the afterlife. The source uses this to highlight a worldview of tragic separation.
If you believe the world is fundamentally severed from the divine, that human life is inherently corrupt and fallen, then the physical world loses its sacred harmony. Life becomes a brutal, chaotic theater of conflict where divine justice is entirely deferred to the afterlife. The bodies don't matter, only the spiritual sorting later matters.
Right. Whereas the concept of hububiyat argues that God is intimately, painstakingly involved in the harmony of this life right now. There is no sorting it out later because the Rabb is constantly sorting, nurturing, and educating through every single event that occurs in the material world.
Which forces us to confront the reality of living in that material world, because even if we accept that life is a harmonious journey of turbi rather than a tragic punishment, it certainly doesn't feel harmonious when we are suffering.
Definitely not.
Life is undeniably full of brutal hardships, illnesses, financial ruin, and emotional devastation.
This brings us to a massive psychological pivot in the lecture. Since life on Earth is harmonious, but still a place of turbi, we inevitably face tests. But how should we interpret them? What the Arabic tradition calls imtihan.
The lecture completely reframes how we are supposed to process the bad things that happen to us. It introduces a paradigm-shifting idea. Calamities, illness, poverty, unrest. They are not signs of God's absence or anger. They are direct, concentrated manifestations of his rububiyat.
They're signals of intense divine attention.
Yes, they aren't losses. They are opportunities to level up.
It's like having a tough love coach. If the coach is yelling at you and putting you through grueling drills, it means they see your potential. If they ignore you, that's when you should worry. If you're an athlete and your coach pulls you aside, makes you run laps until you vomit, relentlessly points out every flaw, it is a miserable experience.
But any elite athlete knows that this specific kind of friction is the highest compliment.
Exactly. They're willing to invest their time and energy to break your bad habits and rebuild you stronger.
The lecture argues that applying this framework to life's calamities completely alters their psychological impact. If you view a sudden illness or a financial collapse merely as a senseless loss, the calamity multiplies.
It compounds.
It doubles, triples, up to 100 times. The initial pain is compounded by a sense of victimhood, bitterness, and the feeling that the universe is cruel and random. You end up crushed under life.
But if you possess the mental framework to recognize the test as customized divine attention, as a specific drill designed by the ultimate coach to target a specific weakness in your character, you have to ride on top of life.
You surf the hardship.
Right. You ask, what am I supposed to learn from this friction, instead of why is this happening to me? And to drive this point home, Islamoğlu shares an incredible anecdote about a Sahaba, a companion of the Prophet Muhammad.
Oh, the staircase story.
This might be the most memorable part of the entire lecture for me. So we have this companion who has made up his mind to divorce his wife.
He is resolute.
He leaves his home, heading out to find the Prophet to initiate the proceedings. His wife is trailing behind him, utterly bewildered, asking why, because as far as they both know, they get along perfectly.
They're having this tense conversation while walking down a set of stairs, and suddenly, the wife loses her footing. She takes a nasty tumble, falling all the way down to the bottom of the staircase.
A completely random, painful accident. But the husband's reaction is extraordinary. He watches her fall, stops in his tracks, and says, "Never mind, I'm staying."
The wife, likely in pain and even more confused now, is just like, what?
Right. She asks him why a fall down the stairs would change his mind about a divorce. His reasoning reveals the core of this philosophy. He explains that for the past 6 months, their lives had been completely frictionless. They hadn't suffered a single bad thing, and because of that prolonged absence of hardship, he'd become terrified that God had forgotten them.
He interpreted the lack of friction as a lack of turbi.
Yes.
He assumed that because they weren't being tested, they were no longer enrolled in the divine school. But the moment she fell down the stairs, it provided the friction he was looking for. The fall proved God still remembered them.
What's fascinating here is how this flips our modern pursuit of perpetual comfort entirely on its head. Today, the ultimate goal for most people is to build a life with zero friction. Maximum convenience, absolute financial security, zero emotional discomfort.
If something goes wrong, we view it as a glitch in the matrix.
We spend 6 months with no problems, and we pat ourselves on the back for being so successful. But this worldview suggests that a frictionless life might actually be a neglected life. The friction is the evidence of the polish.
It builds an unparalleled psychological resilience. You literally cannot be defeated by hardship if you view hardship as the very mechanism of your elevation.
So to truly understand this intense, attentive relationship, we have to look at the ultimate examples of tested individuals, the prophets.
If anyone received the intensive, advanced course in divine discipline, it was the prophets. And the source points out that all their prayers centered on the word Rabb. They don't simply cry out to a generic creator. In their moments of absolute desperation, they specifically call upon their nurturer.
Let's examine the case studies the lecture provides, starting with Noah.
Noah represents the turbi of prolonged, agonizing failure, preaching day and night, only to push his people further away. He hits a wall of utter, crushing despair. He realizes he has exhausted his human capacity. And in that moment, he cries out to his Rabb. He appeals directly to the aspect of God that oversees the long, arduous process of development.
Then the lecture shifts to the confrontation between Abraham and King Nimrod. I love this story. This is a masterclass in understanding sovereignty. Abraham says, "My Rabb gives life and death."
And Nimrod, who is arrogant and intoxicated by his own absolute political power, claims he can too. He thinks because he has the power to execute or pardon people, he's the ultimate lord. To prove his supremacy, Nimrod tries to throw Abraham into a massive fire.
From a purely material standpoint, Nimrod has won.
But the source makes a profound point here. Nimrod actually threw faith into the fire, not realizing that the fire itself had a Rabb. What Nimrod's arrogant worldview could not comprehend was that fire is not an independent actor in the universe. It operates strictly within the parameters set by divine lordship. The ultimate test of Abraham's turbi was trusting that the Lord of the fire would nurture him through the flames.
The curriculum of turbi is also vividly detailed in the story of Yusuf or Joseph. The lecture calls Surah Yusuf the ultimate masterclass in turbi.
It is a relentless series of degradations.
Think about the sequence. Thrown in a well by his brothers, sold into slavery, imprisoned, slandered, only to eventually become the Sultan of Egypt.
The lecture asks us to view this not as a series of tragic misfortunes, but as a meticulously designed syllabus.
And the source draws a beautiful, subtle connection here to Prophet Muhammad. It suggests that the revelation of this story was God telling Muhammad, "You are the Yusuf of Mecca, and Medina will be your Egypt."
A beautiful foreshadowing.
It reframes everything for Muhammad as he faces persecution. It acts as comfort. Finally, the lecture looks at Musa, or Moses. It focuses on a highly specific moment in his timeline, a moment the lecture calls his 0 point.
Right. After fleeing Egypt as a wanted man, he arrives in Midian. Exhausted, stripped of all power, all his royal privileges, he is entirely alone. He is at absolute rock bottom.
And in that moment of total emptiness, he makes a prayer. He says, "My Rabb, I am in desperate need of whatever good you send." He appeals to the nurturer.
And the profound insight here is that this 0 point is actually the prerequisite for his elevation. It is the moment of maximum turbi. When you are full of your own ego, there is no room for divine instruction.
They have to be emptied out first. We all hit our 0 points in careers or relationships. That's the moment of maximum turbi.
Exactly. Which brings us to a critical juncture. If the prophets fully embraced God's lordship, his rububiyyat, what happens when people actively reject it? The source argues that we deeply misunderstand historical and modern disbelief.
This was a massive paradigm shift for me. Because when we think of the villains of religious history, we assume their primary sin was atheism. We assume they denied the existence of God. But the lecture drops a bombshell. The destroyed nations like pharaohs or the Meccan polytheists didn't actually deny the existence of a creator God.
No, they didn't. Let's provide the context for Pharaoh. Pharaoh said, "I am your supreme Rabb."
We usually interpret that as Pharaoh claiming to have physically created the universe.
But he wasn't claiming to have created the stars. He wasn't claiming to be the architect of the cosmos. He was claiming ultimate sovereignty over human lives. He was declaring, "I'm the one who sets the societal rules. I am the ultimate arbiter in this kingdom." He wasn't replacing God the creator. He was replacing God the Lord.
And the lecture applies this exact same logic to the Meccan polytheists. If you ask the Meccan polytheists who created the heavens and earth, they would unhesitatingly say, Allah.
They deeply believed in Allah as the supreme creator.
So what does this all mean? If they fully believed in God the creator, why were they considered polytheists? Why were they fighting a war against the prophet?
Their issue was with rububiyat. They were terrified of a lord who intervened in their daily lives. Their attitude was, God created the heavens, let God stay in the sky. Don't mix Allah with trade. Don't mix Allah with politics.
They wanted to carve out a massive God-free zone on earth. You can have the sky, but the market belongs to us.
And again, neutrally reporting the source's critique here, modern secularism, what it calls modern kahilia, does the exact same thing. People believe in God, some even pray, but they completely reject God's intervention in their daily lives. Keep religion in the private sphere, don't mix God with corporate ethics or political policy.
But the lecture insists that this attempt at compartmentalization is fundamentally impossible. You cannot carve out a space where the Rabb does not govern. To illustrate this, the host, well, the source, rather shares the story of the poet Sirani during the Tanzimat period in the Ottoman Empire.
Sirani was highly critical of the secularizing reforms of the time. His poetry deeply angered Sultan Abdülmecid.
And the Sultan decides to exile him from Istanbul. But Sirani effectively tells the Sultan, if you want to exile me, find a place not created by Allah.
And he was exiled to Aleppo, which is obviously still Allah's domain. The Sultan is merely moving the poet from one room in God's house to another. The point is, there is no true exile from lordship.
Which brings us to the ultimate, inescapable conclusion. So what happens to those who undergo this turbi, and what happens to those who refuse it? What's the final destination? The source links the name Rabb with two other names, Rahim, which means merciful, and Ghafur, which means forgiving.
Establishing this link addresses the reality of the human condition. Humanity is flawed. If we weren't flawed, if we were perfect, we wouldn't need turbi in the first place. God disciplines, but forgives.
We look at Mecca. We often view early Islamic history in Mecca as just a period of brutal torture and oppression.
But the source reframes it. Mecca was a school of turbi. Without graduating from the Mecca school, there would be no Medina. The suffering was the curriculum that built their spiritual resilience.
And that leads to how the lecture defines heaven. The source explains that heaven is the result of rububiyat. It is a place of produced beauty where humans enter perfected, camel not deficient. You don't enter heaven carrying the spiritual diseases of the earthly world.
Earth is the factory floor, heaven is the pristine showroom for the finished product.
But this introduces the most startling concept in the entire source. Because if the Rabb is merciful and forgiving, how does a merciful Rabb create hell? It's a theological paradox.
The source theorizes that hell is also a manifestation of rububiyat.
Which blew my mind.
It uses a highly effective medical metaphor. It describes hell as an intensive care unit, an ICU.
Okay, let's explore the mechanics of this analogy.
The earthly world, with all its trials, is a place of light care. The turbi we experience here is the medicine meant to cure our spiritual diseases. But what if a soul absolutely refuses the treatment? What if they stubbornly reject the discipline and leave this earthly life spiritually diseased?
It's like refusing to take your physical therapy seriously. You suffer a fracture, you refuse the brace, you refuse the therapy, and the bone heals completely deformed. Light care is no longer an option. Eventually, you have to undergo a painful, major surgery to re-break and fix the bone.
The surgery is severe, it is bloody, it is incredibly painful, but the purpose is still healing.
The pain is restorative, not retributive.
If a soul refuses to be disciplined and cured in the light care of the earthly world, they require the intensive care of the afterlife, the intensive care of hell.
I mean, I have to wonder about the concept of eternity there. But the expert emphasizes the source's conclusion on this. The speaker goes out of their way to quote that God's mercy encompasses everything.
And yes, according to the source, that includes hell. Even the intensive care of hell is ultimately a manifestation of a mercy that refuses to allow a soul to remain permanently sick.
It integrates the entire universe into one cohesive hospital of spiritual development. We have covered an immense amount of ground today.
We really have.
Let's recap this incredible journey. We've gone from Abu Bakr doubling an allowance for a slanderer, showing that true turbie requires transcending base instincts,
to redefining Islam as willingly paying a cosmic debt rather than a crushing burden.
We contrasted the tragic worldview of original sin with the Islamic narrative of harmony, where earth is a reward. We learned to view calamities as divine attention, proving a frictionless life might be a neglected one.
We redefined polytheism not as denying the creator, but rejecting the Rabb's intervention in daily life.
And finally, reframing hell as an ICU of divine nurturing. At the very end of this source, Islamoğlu brings all this together with a long list of prayers that end the material.
He reflects on Adam, Noah, Abraham, Yusuf, Musa, Muhammad at Taif. All of them pleaded, using the word Rabbin my Rab. In every instance, they all acknowledged they wronged themselves.
And their deepest prayer wasn't transactional.
Yeah.
They begged not to be left to their own devices. They wanted continuous turbie. They didn't want to be abandoned to their egos.
Because without that divine friction, they recognized they would fail.
This has been one of the most intellectually heavy deep dives we have ever done. It fundamentally alters the geometry of how you view your own suffering. And I want to deliver a final provocative thought for you, the listener, to mull over, building on the source, but introducing a new angle.
Okay, let's hear it.
If every hardship is actually a form of turbie, a customized curriculum designed by the ultimate teacher to perfect your character, what if the most frustrating person in your life right now, or your biggest current obstacle, isn't actually your enemy? What if that colleague who undermines you, or that family member who tests your patience, is simply an unwitting employee of your Rabb, hired specifically to teach you the exact lesson you've been refusing to learn? You stop fighting the person, and you start looking for the lesson they were sent to deliver.
That completely revolutionizes how you engage with conflict.
The universe isn't happening to you, it's happening for you. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the sources today. We encourage you to keep questioning and keep learning. Until next time.
It is? Today's material is a theological lecture illustrating how God's lordship, or the divine name Rabb, manifests as a merciful but difficult process of spiritual education. Diving right into the feedback, the contrast drawn between Islamic harmony and Christian tragedy offers a fascinating philosophical pivot, yet its integration into the broader discourse feels disjointed.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the material shifts really abruptly from practical, intimate spiritual discipline to this massive, aggressive theological comparison.
Right, because the opening establishes this deeply moving, micro-level thesis using the story of Abu Bakr.
Exactly. He continues to financially support Mista, a guy who actively slandered his daughter, which is wild to think about.
It is. But he does it because he's operating under the framework of divine education. He recognizes the betrayal isn't just some random attack.
Yeah, it's a customized test for his own spiritual elevation.
So as a reader, you're fully grounded in these exhausting everyday trials of faith, like raising children or dealing with family betrayal, you know?
Right, the stuff everyone can relate to.
And then, suddenly, the text leaps into this sweeping macro-historical critique. We're suddenly reading about original sin, the development of Western Greek theater, and Pope Pius ordering the deaths of 30,000 people.
Talk about whiplash.
Yeah, exactly. The connective tissue between the quiet, internal struggle of forgiving a relative and this century-spanning critique of Western civilization's foundations is heavily underdeveloped. It just leaves the audience completely disoriented.
It really does. The weakness here is that without a clear bridge, the historical critique reads like a sudden, totally unrelated essay just inserted into a piece about personal spiritual growth.
So how do we fix that?
To solve this, my suggestion is that the text needs to explicitly frame the concept of tragedy as a direct failure to recognize divine discipline, or Tedbiryay.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, the writer needs to show that without the lens of Rabb, as an active, loving educator, all earthly suffering inevitably looks like a meaningless tragedy.
Right. So if we take Abu Bakr's betrayal and remove that concept of divine discipline,
If you strip away the idea that the betrayal is a pedagogical tool designed to elevate his soul, yeah.
then it just evolves into a senseless, tragic event. Viewing trials through a purely worldly lens creates the exact tragedy the Greeks were writing about.
Spot on. Because the Greek theatrical tradition, it relies heavily on the concept of fatalistic doom. You know, or the capricious whims of the gods.
Characters just suffer pointlessly.
Exactly. The author needs to demonstrate that when a civilization lacks the framework of rububiyet, they really have no choice but to interpret suffering as a tragedy.
And conversely, viewing those exact same trials through rububiyet creates that profound harmony the text mentioned earlier.
Yeah. By making that mechanism explicit, the historical detour transforms. It becomes this really powerful proof of concept for the main thesis.
Pope Pius and the Greek theater reference suddenly belong in the exact same room as the Abu Bakr example.
Right. They become two sides of the same coin. It demonstrates what happens on a civilizational level when a society just entirely lacks the framework of tarbiyah.
But the author really has to walk the reader through that underlying logic, right?
Oh, definitely. I mean, original sin, as it's referenced in the text, posits a foundational inherent flaw requiring dramatic salvation.
Whereas the concept of Tedbiryay posits an active, ongoing educational process where even pain serves a highly calculated purpose.
Right. And pointing out the distinction isn't enough. The author has to explicitly explain how these differing theological starting points actually dictate whether a society produces narratives of harmony or narratives of tragedy.
That makes total sense. And that civilizational failure to understand divine discipline isn't just trapped in ancient history. It's the exact same psychological mechanism driving modern secularism today. Moving to our next point, the characterization of modern secularism effectively highlights the rejection of divine intervention, but the argument's depth is masked by overly generalized rhetoric.
Yeah, the text transitions into a critique of what it calls modern kahilya, arguing that contemporary people believe in God but absolutely refuse his interference in politics, trade, and daily life.
They bring up that great quote from the poet Sayrani's challenge to Sultan Abdulmajid about trying to find a place outside of God's domain.
It's a great reference, but the underlying weakness here is that the critique leans on a highly familiar, somewhat tired trope.
The idea that modern individuals simply want to compartmentalize God out of sheer convenience or arrogance.
Exactly. The author repeatedly uses the phrase, "Karishtir Allah," meaning don't mix God into this.
Yeah, as I understand it, from the notes, the argument portrays the modern mindset as like acknowledging the architect who built your house, but aggressively locking them out when they come to fix the plumbing.
That's a perfect analogy. And while it captures the absurdity of the secular impulse, just dismissing moderns as merely arrogant is pretty superficial.
It really misses the opportunity to explore the deeper why behind this psychological compartmentalization.
Right. So my suggestion to elevate the argument is to connect that modern desire for compartmentalization directly back to the human fear of tarbiyah.
The inherent, visceral pain of being tested, corrected, and molded.
Exactly. Elevating the critique requires moving from a place of just pointing out arrogance to diagnosing a profound psychological fear.
So to implement this, the writer must reframe the modern secular mindset, not just as a rebellious power grab, but as a tragic, desperate avoidance of the Yon Bakrumunite.
Yes, the intensive care unit of divine discipline that they mention later in the text.
Because an intensive care unit implies critical vulnerability, extreme intervention, and, honestly, a complete loss of personal control in the pursuit of healing.
That's exactly it. Modern humans push God out of politics, out of economics, out of their social lives because they are absolutely terrified of the refining fire of spiritual testing.
Because that testing inherently comes with letting the Rabb govern those messy arenas.
Right. I mean, if God enters your trade, your financial security will be tested. You might have to endure poverty to learn a moral lesson.
And if God enters your politics, your grip on power and your ego will be tested.
The modern person just wants the comforts of belief without the friction of the chisel.
They don't want the divine sculptor bringing the mallet into their bank accounts or their political campaigns. It's simply too painful.
Yeah, they'd much rather keep their lives unshaped and compartmentalized if it means avoiding the strike of the tool.
This psychological mechanism, the ego's defense against the pain of growth, it has to be made explicit on the page.
By tweaking this section to highlight the specific fear of the intensive care unit, the critique transforms from a standard religious complaint into a profound observation about human vulnerability.
It demonstrates that the secular impulse is actually a defense mechanism against the pain of tarbiyah.
And making that adjustment brings the reader directly into the critique.
Because we all have specific compartmentalized areas of our lives where we fear being tested by our Creator.
Exactly. Diagnosing this fear holds a mirror up to the reader, forcing self-reflection.
Whereas just accusing modern society of arrogance allows the reader to point a finger at some abstract external enemy.
The effectiveness of the argument hinges on empathy. If the author can show they understand why the modern mind runs from God's discipline, the ensuing critique lands with so much greater force.
It establishes a dynamic where the author isn't just lecturing, but actively dissecting our shared human condition.
Yeah, so much more compelling.
Which naturally leads us to the culmination of all this psychological resistance, this deep-seated fear of entering the spiritual intensive care unit, brings us to the polar opposite reaction found in the text's climax: total submission. Our final point is that the concluding litany of prophetic prayers carries immense emotional weight, though its sheer volume dilutes the specific thematic resonance of each prophet's unique trial.
Right. The final section presents this lengthy, really emotionally charged litany of prophetic invocations.
We read the prayers of Adam, Noah, Abraham, Joseph, Moses, Zechariah, and finally Muhammad at the devastating moment of Taif.
It's beautiful, but the weakness is that these prayers are listed in such rapid succession that it basically becomes a catalog of supplications.
It moves so quickly from one prophet to the next.
Yeah, and because of that, it loses the distinct lesson of divine education that each figure uniquely represents within the essay's framework. The specific tarbiyah is lost in the sheer volume of these beautiful but untethered quotes.
Now, I anticipate a desire to aggressively edit this down for structural reasons. But let me push back fiercely on that impulse.
Oh, I agree. Don't cut it.
If we tighten this down too much, we kill the passion. The hypnotic, chanting quality of this final prayer is its greatest strength.
It builds this incredible emotional crescendo.
Like a wave gathering momentum and crashing over the reader. If we start cutting quotes to make it intellectually tidy, we turn a piece of profound poetry into a dry textbook conclusion.
Right, so the challenge is fixing the focus without sacrificing the emotional wave.
Exactly.
So my suggestion here isn't to cut the prayers. The goal is to anchor them.
Because emotion devoid of structure is just a fireworks display, where everything explodes at once.
As bright and loud, but ultimately chaotic and forgettable.
So how do we structure it?
By maintaining the poetic length, but consolidating the impact with brief, thematic anchors to each prophet's invocation, we essentially choreograph the finale.
The author needs to explicitly echo the specific lessons on wealth, patience, and trials that were meticulously established in the first half of the material.
Let's look at a concrete example. For Joseph, or Yusuf, the text cites his prayer. Prison is better than what they call me to.
Right now, it's kind of just floating there as a beautiful expression of endurance.
Exactly. To anchor it, the author must add a brief phrase connecting it back to the earlier point about the well and the prison being his specific school of discipline.
Because the text established earlier that Yusuf's story is a masterclass in tarbiyah.
Yeah. So in the climax, the writer shouldn't just drop the quote in isolation. They should introduce it by saying something like, "We pray with the words of Yusuf, who graduated from the dark school of the well in the isolation of the prison, saying, 'Prison is better.'"
That immediately ties the emotional plea back to the core intellectual thesis of God as an active educator.
It brings it full circle.
We see the same missed opportunity with the final invocation of Muhammad at Taif. The text paints a visceral picture of him exhausted, bleeding, with nowhere to turn, reaching out to his Rabb.
But it doesn't explicitly tie his physical exhaustion back to the earlier crucial concept of the 0 point, or sifr nuqtasi.
Taif cannot just be presented as a tragedy. It has to be framed as the ultimate graduation from the school of Mecca before receiving the reward of Medina.
The author already established that Mecca was a school, a place of intense spiritual molding, not just a place of arbitrary torture.
So in the final prayer, the text must remind the reader of that exact mechanism.
It should read something along the lines of, "We pray with the prophet at the 0 point of Taif, passing the final agonizing test of the Meccan school."
These small contextual anchors serve as vital connective tissue.
They take a beautiful but loose list and weave it into a tightly bound thematic finale. Every prophet's suffering is given a specific pedagogical context.
Adam's prayer becomes the lesson of the school of exile. Noah's prayer becomes the lesson of the school of patience against systemic mockery.
Structure does not inhibit emotion, It amplifies it.
Absolutely. When the reader understands the specific, educational weight of what each prophet endured, the emotional resonance of their final submission is magnified.
It honors the immense passion of the text while rigorously enforcing its brilliant thesis, right up to the very last syllable.
The reader shouldn't just be washed over by the sincerity of the prayers. They should instinctively connect that sincerity back to the intellectual framework of Rubaiyat we spent the entire material building.
Yeah, that connection is what makes the ending truly unforgettable.
Well, to summarize our analysis of the material today, first, we explored the necessity of bridging the gap between personal discipline and macro-historical tragedy. By framing the concept of tragedy as a direct failure to recognize divine discipline, the author seamlessly connects intimate stories of forgiveness to sweeping historical critiques of Western philosophy, showing how the presence or absence of Rububiyyat shapes entire civilizations.
Right.
Second, we addressed deepening the psychological critique of modern secularism. Rather than relying on superficial accusations of arrogance, the material must tie the modern desire to compartmentalize God directly to the ego's terror of being disciplined, that fear of entering the spiritual intensive care unit.
Yes, the Yom Bakamunite.
And finally, we discussed anchoring the climactic prophetic prayers. By keeping the poetic momentum, but adding brief thematic callbacks to the specific schools each prophet endured, the finale becomes an emotionally overwhelming and intellectually flawless conclusion.
I just want to add, the sheer depth of this source material is genuinely profound.
It really is.
It tackles one of the most difficult, enduring questions of human existence: why we suffer and the precise mechanics of how we are shaped by that suffering. And it does so with immense grace and scholarly rigor.
The exploration of Rububiyyat presented here is honestly a masterclass in theological synthesis.
These structural and thematic adjustments we talked about are simply about ensuring the brilliance of the underlying insights isn't obscured by sudden leaps in logic or untethered bursts of emotion.
We warmly invite the listener to apply these structural, psychological, and thematic adjustments and submit their revised work back to the critique for further exploration. It is always a privilege to see how a piece evolves and strengthens after undergoing this analytical process.
Definitely.
If you watch a master sculptor at work on a raw block of marble, the initial stages look almost violent. Chunks of stone fly everywhere. Heavy strikes land with a mallet. To someone who doesn't know what's happening, it looks like destruction.
Right, it looks like chaos.
But when you finally understand the mind of the sculptor, you stop mourning the pieces of stone that fall to the floor. You realize they had to be cleared away to reveal the masterpiece hidden underneath. Keep carving.
Welcome to the debate. So imagine, if you will, being enrolled in a school where, you never actually applied.
Right.
Taking a curriculum you never saw and realizing that every single event in your life, every joy, every loss, even the mundane interactions, it's all a meticulously designed examination by a grandmaster. You aren't just living, you are being sculpted.
And imagine that the tuition for this school is infinite. It is a debt you incur with literally every single breath you take. And if things are going too well, like if you finally find a fleeting moment of peace, you don't feel relief.
Yeah, you feel terror.
Sheer terror, exactly. You're terrified that the headmaster has just forgotten you.
And today we are undertaking a deep, philosophical and theological exploration of the Islamic concept of Rabb, which translates to Lord or Sustainer, and the overarching framework of Rububiyyat, or divine lordship. We're unpacking the etymological roots of the word Islam, the divine names, and really how these concepts construct a complete worldview through the historical lives of the prophets.
And the central question we are wrestling with today is this. Does this concept of rububiyet, which frames all of human existence, our suffering, our wealth, as tools of divine discipline, known as Tedbiryay, does it fundamentally represent a system of profound cosmic harmony and ultimate mercy, or does it construct a totalizing framework of relentless psychological testing and infinite debt that essentially, criminalizes human autonomy?
I represent the position that when you look at the mechanics of this theology, you see an extraordinarily elegant, deeply nurturing system. It's a framework where human limitations are constantly met with divine grace, where absolutely nothing is meaningless, and every hardship is ultimately an act of love meant to elevate us.
And I come at it from a very different angle. I argue that while the premise claims this system is rooted in harmony, the actual evidence, the mechanics of how this theology operates in daily life, it paints a picture of an inescapable trial. It outlines a highly demanding paradigm where human beings are placed in a state of perpetual insolvency. It's an existence where the psychological stakes are just so unimaginably high that true autonomy is rendered completely impossible.
Let me start by outlining exactly why I view rububiyet as the ultimate system of divine love. We have to first off draw a stark contrast between this Islamic view of humanity and the Western, specifically Christian doctrine of original sin.
Okay, how so?
Well, under original sin, humanity starts in the negative, right? You are born into tragedy, you're inherently flawed, and you're embroiled in this cosmic conflict from day one. But in the framework of rububiyet, human beings are built for harmony. You start at zero, not in a deficit of sin. And that brings in this crucial concept of Tedbiryay, which means divine discipline or nurturing.
But nurturing implies a gentle process, doesn't it? The reality of Tedbiryay, when you examine it closely, is incredibly harsh.
It can be demanding, certainly, but look at the function it serves. Tedbiryay means that everything you encounter, whether it's a sudden financial loss, a difficult child, a health scare, it's completely reframed. It ceases to be just random, chaotic suffering in a cold universe.
It becomes a test.
It becomes a bespoke educational tool. You are under the constant, caring attention of the divine. Suffering is not a punishment for being inherently broken. It's a customized curriculum designed to elevate you. The Creator is not just a watchmaker who wound up the universe and walked away to let it tick. He is the Rabb, the active sustainer who cares enough about your ultimate spiritual success to directly intervene in your daily life.
I understand the psychological appeal of that framing. I really do. It is incredibly comforting to believe that your pain has a bespoke purpose, that a grand master is watching over your every move. But when we look at the specific historical and practical examples of this Tedbiryay in action, it reveals a high-stakes, almost suffocating existence. We need to talk about the etymology of the Arabic word for religion, deen.
Right, which fundamentally means debt.
Exactly. Deen means debt, and Islam historically meant paying that debt in full to a creditor. But here is the catch. This theology explicitly states that the debt of life is infinite. Literally every single breath is a debt. You cannot ever pay it back.
Yes, because the gift of life is so vast.
But the result is that humanity is placed in a position of perpetual, inescapable insolvency. I argue that this doesn't create harmony, it creates a psychological pressure cooker. It is a system of total submission where you can never, ever balance the ledger.
I see why you think that, I really do. But let me give you a different perspective on how this discipline actually manifests in practice. Think of Tedbiryay like a master sculptor chiseling a block of marble.
Okay.
To the marble, the strikes of the hammer might seem violent, sudden, painful. But the sculptor isn't attacking the stone. The sculptor is removing everything that isn't the masterpiece. The suffering is purely divine pedagogy.
But the marble doesn't feel pain. Humans do.
Which makes the human transformation all the more profound. Look at the historical reality of this. Take the companion of the Prophet, Hazrat Abu Bakr. He was financially supporting a poor relative named Mistah.
But Mr. participated in spreading a horrific, incredibly damaging slander about Ebu Bakir's own daughter, Hazrat Aisha. Naturally, as any human father would in 7th century Arabia, or anywhere today for that matter, Ebu Bakir was deeply hurt and outraged, so he cut off the financial support. He essentially said, not a penny more.
Which is a completely rational, justified human response.
Exactly. Human instinct dictates retaliation, or at least withdrawing favor. But then, divine intervention occurs. A verse is revealed suggesting this wasn't the most beautiful, forgiving behavior expected of a believer aiming for the highest spiritual elevation. And what does Ebu Bakir do?
He relents.
The mechanism of tarbiyah kicks in. He turns to his Rabb and says, I promise I will give him twice as much from now on. That is the genius of this system. The betrayal wasn't just a random tragedy. It was a highly specific mechanism designed to elevate Ebu Bakir's soul to a level of radical forgiveness that completely defies human instinct. It transforms visceral pain into profound spiritual beauty.
That is a compelling argument, I admit, and I won't deny the moral beauty of the Ebu Bakir story. It is a stunning example of grace, but have you considered the darker psychological underbelly of this exact same system? Because for every Ebu Bakir finding radical forgiveness, there is an example of this discipline conditioning the human mind in ways that look, well, terrifying to an outside observer.
What do you mean by terrifying?
Take another historical example from the material, another Sahrami, a companion of the Prophet. He is walking down the stairs with his wife, getting ready to go complain to the Prophet because they are having marital issues and are planning to separate. Suddenly, his wife trips and tumbles all the way down the stairs. And the husband's reaction?
Well, he is relieved.
Relieved is putting it mildly. He is overjoyed. He immediately cancels the trip to the Prophet. Why? Because for the last 6 months, they had experienced total peace. No tragedy, no suffering, no illness, and that peace terrified him.
Because the peace implied
And by the headmaster. I mean, ask yourself, can a system where believers are literally relieved by sudden physical trauma because mere peace implies divine abandonment truly be called harmonious?
it shifts the perspective on what harmony means, certainly.
To me, that inherently breeds a state of constant psychological anxiety. If you are happy, you are terrified. If you are suffering, you are grateful. It completely inverts basic human well-being.
That's a really interesting point, though I would frame it differently. The inversion you're talking about is actually the intended feature, not a bug. This theology argues that life's superficial comforts often put us to sleep spiritually. The Sahabe wasn't rejoicing in his wife's pain out of malice, right? He was experiencing a radical paradigm shift, where the eternal stakes heavily outweigh temporary physical comforts.
But it requires living in constant fear of comfort.
It requires living in constant awareness. Let's move from the physical trials to the underlying spiritual mechanics for a second. Let's go back to that concept of the infinite debt. You called it a psychological pressure cooker, but let's look at how the debt is actually resolved. Yes, pre-Islamic Arabs used the word Islam to mean willingly paying one's debt in full. And yes, every breath is a debt you owe to the sustainer.
Right, a debt you can never, ever repay.
Right. It's almost like trying to pay off a multi-billion-dollar cosmic mortgage with pocket change. You physically can't. But this is where the profound mercy of Rububiyyat comes in. The Creator doesn't demand you actually pay the infinite sum. He simply asks you to admit the debt exists.
Just admit it?
That's it. The moment you drop your ego and say, I owe you everything, I cannot pay it, the Creator essentially looks at your account and hits forgive balance. He accepts that confession of insolvency as full payment and rewards you with paradise on top of it. It's the ultimate debt jubilee. It's an act of supreme mercy, not a pressure cooker.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why that debt jubilee analogy masks something much more restrictive. You're framing this as a beautiful, easy release of debt. But the assertion that every breath, every moment is a debt that cannot be paid sets up a fundamentally impossible dynamic. This isn't a transaction between equals. It is a demand for absolute submission to a totalizing existential monopoly.
A monopoly on what? Existence?
On your very being, you are stripped of all inherent merit. The only way you are saved is by acknowledging your complete and utter bankruptcy. When this theology says that every breath is a debt, it means absolutely nothing is yours. Not your body, not your thoughts, not your hard-earned achievements.
Because they are gifts?
But it demands a psychological surrender that completely eradicates the concept of human autonomy. If I hold a debt over you that is so massive you could never repay it in a billion lifetimes, and I tell you, just admit you are my debtor forever, and we're good, I am not freeing you. I am owning you. That is what this system does. It owns the human being completely.
I understand why that sounds suffocating. Hitting that level of submission is terrifying by modern human standards. But analytically speaking, if we accept the premise of the theology, we are owned. That is the ontological reality being presented. We didn't create ourselves, we don't consciously beat our own hearts, we don't spin the planet.
Sure, but
to claim true independent autonomy in a universe you did not author is, logically speaking, absurd.
But human beings need a sense of agency to function in the world. We need to feel like our choices belong to us.
And they have agency within the framework, but not sovereignty over the framework. This brings up the fascinating concept of shirk or polytheism. This theology points out that ancient polytheists and modern secularists actually share the exact same problem. If you ask the ancient pagans who created the heavens and the earth, they wouldn't say their stone idols did it. They would say Allah. They knew a supreme God existed.
Right, their issue wasn't the existence of a creator.
Exactly. Modern secularists know the universe exists, and many even believe in a creator. Their shared rebellion is against rububiyet, the lordship. They say, you can be the creator, but do not mix into my daily life. Don't mix religion into my commerce. Don't mix it into my politics. Stay in the mosque. Stay in the sky. They want compartmentalized autonomy. But think of the poet Seyrani during the Ottoman Tanzimat period. That was a time of intense modernization and secularizing reforms.
Right.
Sultan Abdulmajid threatened to exile him for his outspokenness. And Seyrani essentially replied, if you want to exile me, find a place Allah didn't create.
Wow, it's a brilliant retort.
It is, because it highlights the logical flaw of secular autonomy from a theological standpoint. True autonomy, this compartmentalized secular life where God isn't allowed to intervene, is an illusion. We are all living in Allah's space. Therefore, submitting to the rules of the sustainer is the only logical harmony. Declaring sovereignty in someone else's house isn't freedom, it's just trespassing.
If you're listening to this, you're probably thinking, wait, keeping religion out of my business decisions or my politics makes me a cosmic trespasser? That sounds extreme. But let's look at the logic of this framework and the extreme implications it carries. This theology frames any desire for human sovereignty, any attempt to create a neutral, secular space for human development, as a direct rebellion akin to the worst villains in history.
It compares them to Pharaoh.
Yes! It equates the modern person who says, let's keep religious doctrine out of the stock market, with Pharaoh, the ancient tyrant who stood up and declared himself the greatest Rabb, or Nimrut, who threw the prophet Ibrahim into a raging fire. By labeling modern secularism as the exact equivalent of Pharaoh's arrogance, this framework leaves absolutely zero room for neutral human existence.
Because neutrality is a myth in this framework.
But look at what that means for everyday life. You are either in total prostrate submission to the discipline of rububiyet, or you are an arrogant tyrant trying to steal God's property. It essentially criminalizes the very foundation of the modern world. It says that the desire to simply manage our own economic and political affairs without divine intervention is a cosmic crime. That is not a nurturing framework. That is a framework of absolute control that cannot tolerate even an inch of independent human agency.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because it assumes human independence in things like commerce or politics actually leads to better outcomes without divine guidance. The theology is suggesting that when humans claim to be their own Rabb in politics or economics, they inevitably end up acting like Pharaoh. They start oppressing others, hoarding wealth, destroying the environment. The absolute control you're pushing back against is actually a safeguard against human tyranny.
A safeguard that requires total submission, though.
let's look at the ultimate consequence of this system, which I think is where the profound mechanism of rububiyet is most evident. What happens to those who reject the discipline, who insist on their autonomy and refuse to pay the debt of gratitude? We have to talk about the concept of hell.
Oh, yeah. This is where the framework gets particularly intense.
It does, but also incredibly nuanced. Hell is not merely a medieval torture chamber of vindictive wrath. This theology introduces hell as a Yom Bakum Yundasi, an intensive care unit.
An intensive care unit made of fire?
Yes, but look at the purpose of it. The theology states that Allah's mercy encompasses all things. Therefore, hell itself is a manifestation of rububiyat, of lordship and nurturing. If you refuse to be disciplined and educated in the gentle tarbiyah of the earthly school, if you remain spiritually diseased, arrogant, and entrenched in your ego, you don't just get discarded into a void. You are placed in intensive care in the afterlife. The fire is a final, extreme form of purification for a soul that refused to heal in the world. It means that God never gives up on the project of elevating the human soul, even in the afterlife.
I will grant you that the idea of hell as a cosmic intensive care unit is a fascinating theological reframe. It certainly sounds more purposeful than arbitrary torture, but if you look closely at the mechanics of it, it actually proves my exact point about the inescapable, totalizing nature of the system.
How so? It's purification.
Because even in eternal punishment, the individual is not allowed to simply fail. You are not allowed to just exist apart from the lordship. You're never allowed to just be left alone. Whether it is in this life or the next, your comfort in your ego are relentlessly obliterated to force compliance.
It's not forcing compliance, it's breaking the illusion of the ego.
Let's look at how that breaking happens, though. Look at the historical examples of the prophets that this theology uses to show tarbiyah in action. Look at Yusuf. He is thrown into a dark, terrifying well by his own brothers. He is sold into slavery. He is thrown into a dungeon for years before he ever becomes a sultan in Egypt.
A perfect example of tarbiyah, elevating someone.
But look at the cost. Look at Musa, fleeing for his life as a desperate, exhausted fugitive to Midian, stripped of his royal upbringing, stripped of everything. Look at Muhammad, bloodied and battered in the city of Taif, pelted with stones, unable to find a single inch of safe ground. The theology glorifies this. It says, look at how beautifully the Rabb disciplined them. But what it is really showing is a system where the individual is crushed. They are utterly broken down to what the theology calls the 0 point, until they have no choice but to cry out, I am nothing, you are everything. The intensive care unit of hell is just the final, inescapable extension of a cosmic monopoly that refuses to take no for an answer.
Let me stop you there because we need to unpack exactly what happens at that 0 point. When Yusuf hits the bottom of the well, or when Musa is starving in the desert, it's not just about physical suffering. The mechanism of tarbiyah requires the total dismantling of human reliance. The moment you realize no human can save you, your ego collapses. And what happens when they hit that 0 point?
They surrender completely.
Yes, but look at the beauty of the surrender. When Musa is exhausted in Midian, he prays, My Rabb, I am in desperate need of whatever good you send me. When Yusuf is languishing in the dungeon, he says, Prison is better than the sin they invite me to. When Muhammad is bleeding in Taif, his prayer isn't for revenge. He prays, As long as you are not angry with me, I don't care about anything else. Hitting 0 isn't destruction of the human being. It's the removal of the false ego, which is the only thing blocking true connection with the divine. That 0 point is the only frequency where true spiritual clarity can happen. What you call psychological demolition is actually waking up from the matrix of the self.
And I argue that waking up from that matrix, breaking the false self, is practically indistinguishable from psychological demolition. The ultimate goal of this system is to bring a human being to the point where they view their own profound suffering as a gift and their own desire for autonomy as a sin. To me, that is the very definition of a totalizing framework. It is intricate, it is historically expansive, and it gives meaning to suffering, yes, but it purchases that meaning
by demanding the absolute surrender of the human will.
As we step back and look at the entirety of this framework, my position remains that Rububiyet is an elegant, all-encompassing system of divine love. Yes, it demands submission, but it is submission to reality itself. By recognizing our inherent limitations, by giving up the illusion that we are sovereign over a universe we didn't create, and by acknowledging our infinite cosmic mortgage to the Creator, we are granted ultimate salvation. Every earthly trial, from interpersonal conflict to profound loss, and indeed even the concept of hell itself, is revealed not as random cruelty, but as an act of profound, purifying mercy designed to educate and elevate the human soul.
And while I acknowledge how conceptually intricate and structurally robust this theology is, I maintain that it outlines a highly stressful existential reality. It is a system where human autonomy is inherently criminalized, equated with the arrogance of Pharaoh. The individual is subjected to a relentless, inescapable battery of psychological and physical testing, where even a moment of peace is cause for terror. It is a brilliant mechanism for explaining suffering, but it does so by demanding the absolute dissolution of independent human agency.
I think where we absolutely converge today is on our appreciation for how masterfully these concepts connect the seemingly dry etymology of ancient Arabic terms like Islam and Deen to a massive, comprehensive worldview.
Oh, absolutely. The intellectual architecture here is undeniable. It takes these linguistic roots of debt and submission and weaves them through the visceral lives of the prophets to construct a seamless, if deeply challenging, explanation of the human condition.
For anyone listening, there is so much more to explore in these concepts. We highly recommend looking closer at the specific prayers of the prophets we mentioned today: Adam, Nuh, Yusuf, Musa. Reading their exact words in their moments of extreme crisis provides an incredible window into how these dynamics of Rububiyet and Tarbiyah actually play out in the human heart.
Yeah, seeing how they construct meaning out of absolute despair at that 0 point is genuinely fascinating, regardless of where you fall on the theological spectrum.
So, are we wandering through a random, chaotic universe where our suffering means absolutely nothing? Or are we students in an inescapable cosmic school where every joy and every pain is a deliberate, loving strike from the master sculptor's chisel?
And if we are in that school, is the tuition of our absolute autonomy a price we are truly willing to pay?
We will leave that for you to decide. Thank you for joining us.
This is the brief on the Islamic concept of Rabb and divine discipline. Drawing from the lectures of Mustafa İslamoğlu, understanding the divine name Rabb, meaning Lord, basically takes our daily struggles and turns them from random chaos into a highly purposeful, customized education. First, we look at Tarbiyah, right? This idea of divine discipline. Think about the trials you're facing. Maybe financial stress, arguments, or even difficult kids. You know, these aren't signs you've been abandoned. They're actually the exact tools God uses to elevate you. Frame these frustrations not as punishments, but as a customized workout plan from a master trainer, literally designed to help you level up. Hardships just prove God is paying attention. Second, actually buying into that workout plan takes a massive philosophical shift. You see, Western thought often views human existence as a tragedy built on original sin, but the Islamic worldview is grounded purely in harmony. Hardship isn't some tragic penalty at all, it's just an educational tool for the soul. So, what happens if we stop viewing our personal crises as tragedies and start seeing them as divine check-ins? Finally, consider how modern society kind of rejects this. In Islam, idolatry is called shirk, but today that doesn't really mean bowing to statues. It looks a lot more like modern secularism. We'll gladly acknowledge God created the universe, but demand he stay completely out of our business and politics. Are we comfortable accepting a creator so long as he doesn't act as a lord who governs our daily choices? Ultimately, acknowledging the lordship of God means accepting that every friction in your life is a deeply personal invitation to grow.
This is the brief on the Islamic concept of Rabb and divine discipline. So this lecture by Mustafa İslamoğlu shows how understanding the Arabic word Rabb totally flips life's hardest challenges from random tragedies into a personalized, divine curriculum meant to elevate your soul. First, Rabb is deeply tied to Tedbiryay, which basically means discipline or education. God uses literally everything, from wealth to painful hardships, as specific tools to test you. Think of Rabb like the ultimate cosmic personal trainer. By adding heavy resistance, they aren't trying to crush you, they're building your spiritual muscle. Realizing your struggles are actually an education completely changes how you view suffering. Second, this shapes a worldview built on harmony rather than tragedy, unlike frameworks centered on original sin. You're inherently built to be in sync with the truth. Now you're probably thinking, well, if we're built for harmony, why do we keep messing up? It's simple, really. Sin is just you resisting the workout, and repentance instantly gets you back in sync. Finally, this isn't just abstract theology. It's the exact survival guide history's major prophets used when hitting rock bottom. Whether it was Abraham in the fire or Muhammad facing brutal rejection in Taif, they leaned on this understanding. In their most desperate prayers, they didn't just beg for their problems to magically vanish. They specifically addressed God as Rabb, acknowledging their struggle as a divine test and asking for the guidance to actually pass it. Ultimately, recognizing God as Rabb means realizing that your deepest crises are actually profound, customized opportunities for your own spiritual growth.
This is the brief on the Islamic concept of God as the Rabb, or divine nurturer. We're breaking down Mustafa İslamoğlu's lecture to see how viewing God as an educator completely reshapes how we handle daily struggles, modern society, and spiritual harmony. First, consider trials as divine education. Hardships, like financial stress or tough relationships, aren't random punishments. They're specific tools God uses to train us. Think of a brilliant, demanding tutor assigning insanely hard problems. It feels completely burdensome, but it's the only way you master the material. If God actively nurtures us, rejecting that daily involvement is the true root of spiritual rebellion. Second, this reveals the real nature of idolatry. Historical polytheists and modern secularists actually share the exact same problem. They don't deny God created the universe, they just reject his lordship, basically telling him to stay out of business and politics. Isn't it totally absurd to acknowledge a supreme creator, but try locking him out of the very world he built? Accepting his active involvement means realizing we owe him everything, which brings us to the original meaning of faith. Finally, the pre-Islamic root of Islam means willingly paying a debt in full. Because we can't possibly repay God for every breath, he accepts our mere confession of the debt as full payment. İslamoğlu contrasts this with doctrines built on tragedy and original sin, noting this Islamic framework relies purely on harmony. It's absolutely fascinating how framing faith as an unpayable debt doesn't cause despair, but eliminates spiritual tragedy and unlocks instant grace. Ultimately, embracing God as a divine nurturer transforms daily hardships into a masterclass for growth, challenges the urge to separate faith from life, and replaces spiritual conflict with the profound harmony of simply acknowledging our infinite debt to the Creator.
This is The Brief on the Islamic concept of divine discipline. Drawing from a lecture by Mustafa İslamoğlu, we're exploring how our wealth, daily frustrations, and life's trials aren't random punishments, but deliberate tools used by the divine to train and elevate us. First, everyday life acts as divine discipline, or Tedbiryay. You see, everything's an instrument for this training. Take Abu Bakr. When his daughter was slandered, he naturally wanted to cut off the slanderer's financial support. But after getting a divine correction, he promised to give the man double. So think of life as a highly customized, intensive tutoring session, where your greatest personal frustrations are precisely the curriculum you need. Second, this connects to the root of Islam as a debt. In pre-Islamic times, the word meant willingly paying a debt in full. But how do you pay a debt when your very currency, every single breath you take, is borrowed? Well, because this debt is unpayable, simply confessing and acknowledging your debt to God is miraculously accepted as full payment. Finally, this reframes trials as divine attention. Hardships are actually proof of God's engagement, not a tragedy. While Western concepts often rely on tragedy and conflict with the divine, this perspective is built purely on harmony. There's a story of a couple who grew deeply worried because nothing bad had happened to them in 6 months. They genuinely feared God had forgotten them. Ultimately, recognizing God's active, disciplinary role transforms life's heaviest burdens into profound opportunities for spiritual growth and harmony. When you realize every test is just a lesson in disguise, the whole world becomes a classroom.
This is the brief on the Islamic concept of God as the Rabb,
or divine nurturer. We're breaking down Mustafa İslamoğlu's lecture to see how viewing God as an educator completely reshapes how we handle daily struggles, modern society, and spiritual harmony. First, consider trials as divine education. Hardships, like financial stress or tough relationships, aren't random punishments. They're specific tools God uses to train us. Think of a brilliant, demanding tutor assigning insanely hard problems. It feels completely burdensome, but it's the only way you master the material. If God actively nurtures us, rejecting that daily involvement is the true root of spiritual rebellion. Second, this reveals the real nature of idolatry. Historical polytheists and modern secularists actually share the exact same problem. They don't deny God created the universe, they just reject his lordship, basically telling him to stay out of business and politics. Isn't it totally absurd to acknowledge a supreme creator, but try locking him out of the very world he built? Accepting his active involvement means realizing we owe him everything, which brings us to the original meaning of faith. Finally, the pre-Islamic root of Islam means willingly paying a debt in full. Because we can't possibly repay God for every breath, he accepts our mere confession of the debt as full payment. İslamoğlu contrasts this with doctrines built on tragedy and original sin, noting this Islamic framework relies purely on harmony. It's absolutely fascinating how framing faith as an unpayable debt doesn't cause despair, but eliminates spiritual tragedy and unlocks instant grace. Ultimately, embracing God as a divine nurturer transforms daily hardships into a masterclass for growth, challenges the urge to separate faith from life, and replaces spiritual conflict with the profound harmony of simply acknowledging our infinite debt to the Creator.